Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome back to another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Today's discussion, we're going to be talking about some more of the content found in the Guide to Excellence in Treasury. We are discussing the final chapter that's titled Basics of Risk Management. I'm Jonathan, Media Production Specialist here at Strategic Treasurer. I'm joined today again by Craig Jeffery. Welcome back to the show.
It's good to talk about this, John. I've looked forward to discussing this book and this chapter in particular.
Yeah, to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about the Guide to Excellence in Treasury?
Yeah, so this is a book that we provided and other materials are following. It's a way to fulfill one of our goals and missions is to inform the broader industry at large. And excellence in Treasury means doing certain things, understanding certain issues, and having a mindset that builds on your practices for how you help your organization. And so this is a way of sharing and setting standards out there for people to read and study in an easy to consume manner. So we have it in digital form that's free to download, and we have it in podcasts like this.
Yeah. And it's not just good in Treasury or good enough in Treasury. It's excellence in Treasury.
So awesome. That's good. The superlative.
So you can find in the show notes a link to download the whole ebook where it goes into much more than just basics of risk management. Before we get into the meat of today's podcast, risk management, could you talk a little bit about risk identification techniques? We don't go into this in the chapter, but I wanted to set the foundation with how do you identify what you need to manage?
Any person who has a risk manager mentality looks and thinks about what could go wrong. And you know people that see physical things like, oh, there's a ladder on a slope, there's spilled water in the aisle at the supermarket or at home, whatever those issues are. These are items where things can go wrong. Just like when it gets wet outside, you hopefully adjust your speed when you're going around a corner so you don't break free from the road and fly off into the woods into a tree. And so risk identification is identifying what are those risks that matter. There's risks for getting up. There's risks for not getting up. How do you make those decisions? So to my way of thinking is risk identifying is scanning the environment. What are the potential risks? And then identifying those that are major or moderate, things that would concern you enough. And, identifying those and calibrating those or ranking those for what matters. And then there's other activities. Do you accept those risks? Do you alter those risks? Do you avoid those risks? There's all kinds of things. You can apply that to your individual life, your personal life, at home, traveling, et cetera. It's what are the things that you need to be concerned about?
What should the process of scanning for those risks look like?
The idea of here are the standard risks that we look at, interest rate risk and foreign exchange, currency pair volatility, what are our exposures there, commodity price risk, counterparty risk across the enterprise, liquidity risk, what if we're not paid or things don't come due on time? How do we build in additional flexibility to manage those? Those are all risks that I think everyone thinks about fairly regularly. How do you keep track of other risks and see what comes on, in the broader market? Geopolitical risks that have a reverberation on the supply chain, and which has an impact on the finance of the organization. So all of those, how do you scan? And so there's different risks that you look at in terms of staying current with what's being discussed as people are looking and say, this could be an issue. You can listen to people that might seem a little extreme in their views about what's happening or what could happen. But even if it's extremely low probability, hearing those items and evaluating those is usually a worthwhile endeavor to a certain extent. Staying current on what people are talking about, where there's volatility, regions of the world, or where you're operating. There's a whole range of that, John. And this idea of we're continually scanning for what we see, we're scanning what people are talking about, we're gaining information from peers, from bankers, from consultants. That's a good way to look at it.
That makes sense. As we move into the conversation on risk management, do you want to give a broad overview of what it is?
If I were to give a definition, it would probably differ depending on the time of day or the time of week. But it's risk management is the process of identifying and managing risk in a way that your goal is to bring your exposures or your risk in line with your risk appetite or risk tolerance. So you make sure that you're operating with risks that are acceptable to you or that are acceptable to your company. So it's identifying those and making sure you're bringing it in line. And there's a lot to unpack there. It's not a default, everything's fine, or I'm ignorant of it, but I understand the environment. I've identified those items and I'm managing them in a way that I've either accepted the risks, I've altered the risk, I've avoided the risk. Not acceptable is I, ignored the risk.
Okay, so in the Guide to Excellence in Treasury, if you download the PDF version, there's this nice little chart in here that's got blue, white, and red, different circles growing in scale with categories of risk management. You want to walk us through those?
The included circles in like a Euler style diagram has the largest circle is capacity, within that is appetite, and then within that is tolerance. So the largest is what's your risk capacity? So anytime you look at the categories of risk, how you measure risk, your capacity to handle risk is the largest circle. Anything more than that, you become insolvent or your business stops or you get shut down, whatever risk you're looking at, that's the maximum that you can stand. The appetite, and not everyone uses the terms risk appetite or risk tolerance. Sometimes they use those interchangeably to mean the same thing, but we look at appetite as the next level down. What the organization states that they're willing to do. And you can think about this at a corporate level. They say they're comfortable with a certain level of risk, but if you hit that risk, they're pretty upset and they didn't like that. Same thing on the individual side. They're like, I'm going to ride I'm putting stuff into the S&P 500 for my investment portfolio. And if there's a bear market, they're like pulling it out. It's like, I lost so much money, and they pull it out. And even though that might have been well within their stated appetite to bear risk for the yield, it really wasn't, because they got nervous when it got close to their level, or even if it was far away from their level. And so that's when we think of tolerance, what you're really tolerant of, what the company is really tolerant to bear, movements that go in a negative way for, commodity prices or, for the currency pair shifts that happen. Capacity, appetite, and tolerance. You want to know what your capacity is, and it's good to really know what the actual tolerance of the company is for losses, because you can get in trouble if you just think what was stated on the risk appetite level is truly sufficient for the organization. You need to know the warning track, which would be the risk tolerance that you have.
Yeah, I could see that happening. Someone says we're willing to lose this amount, and then you lose it. You say, I thought that was fine.
It's exactly what it is. And it's not just that. I know you've got other questions too, but one of the things that happens is, if you put in controls in place, you put financial instruments in place that will provide some financial benefit if your underlying asset or your underlying exposure moves negatively, right? You ended up making money on your hedge, but you lost on your underlying exposure, right? Interest rates went up and now I have to pay more interest, but I had a hedge. I swapped that out through a hedge. So my hedge made money, but my underlying asset or exposure lost. And sometimes people are like, oh, that's great. We made money on the hedge. And that's not what the purpose was at all. The purpose was to bring your risks and your exposures in line with your risk tolerance and your risk appetite to make sure that you're not going to experience something beyond that. When your underlying asset does great and your hedges end out of the money, sometimes there's this negative view of, we would have done better if we didn't hedge at all. This was a waste of money. Why did we do this? What was the purpose of it? You use this as a way of insurance of eliminating a certain negative event. Just because the negative event didn't happen doesn't mean you shouldn't have done it. It's like, yeah, we wasted all that money on life insurance. I didn't die this year. I bought car insurance. Well, you're trying to avoid a catastrophic financial loss or impact. due to certain situations. And so not everybody, not even finance people, many finance people, probably most finance people don't understand that about risk. And so there's all kinds of examples of treasurers getting in trouble for doing and protecting the company. And someone is saying, we would have done better without the hedge. We would have done better without this activity.
I would have done better with a HELOC and put my home equity into a Bitcoin 8 years ago.
The answer to that would be no. For in most cases, unless you're like, hey, my risk level's high, I want to maximize my potential. I don't care about huge loss, right? And it's like, I had a fixed level on my home equity line. I dumped it into something that was extremely speculative. Well, that might be your risk appetite tolerance, and you have a way of covering it. Okay. I said no because that wouldn't make sense to me. But but there's and the difference between let's say a hedge fund and a corporate or a public institution is you are not trying to take a position on the market. You're trying to bring your risks in line with your risk tolerance, your risk appetite. You're not taking a position on the market. Well, I think interest rates are going to go up, or these currency pairs are going to move this way, or I know those things are. Therefore, I'm doing this activity or not. That's not what a corporate treasurer should be doing. That becomes now it's a speculative position. You're taking a position. How do you know that? You don't. You don't know that. If you're a hedge fund, your business is taking positions and speculating on what's going to occur. You're providing great service to the market because you're going to be on the other side of transactions for people who want to reduce their exposure. You're taking exposure because you want what that brings to you. You want that amplified activity. But that is very different from what a corporate treasurer needs to do.
Gotcha. What have you seen happen in your career, whether it's economics or an event that most changed those categories of tolerance?
Capacity really tends to be a fairly static measure in terms of what an organization can bear. Their financial position may shift, so the capacity gets larger as they get larger, or if they have other situations. But the difference between appetite and tolerance is usually that difference is exacerbated or made very clear when a significant event happens. You can think of all the years where if you go back, like 1988, you go to all these different years where significant things happen, 2008, 2009, the beginning of COVID. When these very extreme situations happen, there's a massive amount of movement. Everyone gets extremely concerned. When you should have something that's more consistent, everyone pays attention when those events are happening. They can happen at any time, but there tends to be fairly long periods of stability, in terms of it's not days, it's weeks, it's months, it's years where there's stability. And then there's turmoil. Turmoil can come from different places in different ways.
In the Guide to Excellence in Treasury, you have a breakout of different principles of risk management. Do you want to run us through those?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about those. Some of those people are going to be very familiar with. The number one that we would talk about and that people are familiar with is diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I know some people say you can put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket really carefully. Well, okay, that's maybe good for eggs, but diversification, in terms of credit, in terms of how much exposure you have to any one individual party, who you're exposing your investments to, like a particular industry, particular types of banks, whatever those elements are, whatever those diversification tends to protect us. Tends to protect us well. So diversifying is a foundational method of risk management. Some of these other principles are a framework to policy. Everyone says we need a policy on risk management, a policy on bank account management, a policy on investment management. Well, we always we'd like to think, and we want people to think about what's our framework for understanding risks. And then how does that flow down to policy? So your risk framework should help identify what's our capacity, appetite, and tolerance. How are we going to handle those? What will we do with accepting? How will we accept certain types of risks or exposures? How will we make decisions to avoid them? alter exposure. We want to take on the exposure, but not all of it. So we alter it or we ignore it. And how do we alter it? Do we use financial instruments? Do we use some type of natural hedge? Do we figure out, just some way of keeping all these areas in line with our risk tolerance and our risk appetite? Another area is expect the unexpected. And people say all the time, well, this can't happen again because there's some regulation or the environment's slightly different. And there's a point where that's true. It's like whatever particular event happened won't happen exactly the same way because the world's different, right? It's like the quote, you can't step in the river twice because it's not the same river and you're not the same person, right?
Your feet still get wet.
Well, you still get wet. You could still stumble and get your foot stuck under a rock, whatever those particular items are. But the expected unexpected is always be ready for something's going to happen. You don't know what it is. Just like, in your house, it's like there's always going to be a $5,000 or $10,000 issue that you have to deal with your house at least every 18 months. Something's going to come up. You don't know what it is. The gutter's going to fall off. Something's going to come through your wall or there was a leak, a slow leak you didn't see. There's going to be something. You don't know what it is. And it's probably going to be in that neighborhood of $5,000 to $10,000. And you're like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. You knew something was going to happen in a certain period of time. You didn't know exactly when or exactly how much it was, but there was going to be something. And so you reserve money for, based on the value of your home for repairs and upkeep because it will average out to that. You just don't know when it's going to occur, but expect the unexpected. And I'll give you one example. I was in a remote area of Florida, and I was driving out to let someone in through a gate, through a place we were camping. And we're driving on a dirt road, and I had my young daughter on my lap, driving a van. It was a dirt road, and there was a gate, so there was nobody else there. So I was like, I'll let her drive. As we're driving down the dirt road, and we're going about 40 miles an hour with this long van, right? And one side is a little bit of a field. The other side is a swamp. As we're driving down the dirt road, about 40. So we're humming, right? What can go wrong? She's sitting there steering and I'm driving. I'm right there. Well, she whips the steering wheel in a direction. And so we're all of a sudden, we've broken free from it's not even gravel. It was like dirt. And so now we're fishtailing down the road. And there was that instant sensation that I was going to die. And, adjusting the steering wheel was like, okay, glad I drove in the snow because this was like driving in the snow. Because with that little adjustment, it was like the vehicle was like 45 degrees angled, facing like it was going to launch into the swamp. Was able to correct it. And, after I had calmed down, I was like, what were you thinking of? I just wanted to see what would happen if I yanked the steering wheel away. Well, I hadn't incorporated that type of thinking into my mindset to expect that to occur. And so it's not that I just never trust my kids or whatever, but it's the idea that you don't know what can happen. And so be careful.
Don't put a intern in charge as CFO.
There's all kinds of things. There's quite a few things in here. I won't go through all of them. But I will mention one is David Stowe, who used to work with us a number of years. He and I had many conversations about risk, and one of the phrases was he coined this phrase to describe the situation as like, do you really want your hedges to do well? And the phrase was, don't cheer for your hedges. So, and then that idea is you have a underlying asset. Let's say I have a floating interest rate, okay? And I have a hedge where I fix those. You're like, maybe you fix a percentage of it, or you hedge a certain percentage of FX activity. Do you want your hedges to make money? If you're like, yes, I want my hedges to make money, why would you cheer for them? Because usually you're only hedging a portion of your exposure. If your hedge moves in the opposite direction, let's say you hedge 75%. Let's say you lost $10 million on your exposure, but you made $7.5 million on your hedge. Why are you cheering for your hedge? You're not wanting to lose the extra $2.5 million as if they had stayed stable. And so this idea is, what are you trying to do? That's an insurance policy that moves in the other direction. Now you may cheer for your hedge in a situation where you've hedged, let's say you're an airline and you hedged 75% of your fuel prices, and fuel prices went in a bad direction. and you're hurting, but everybody else in the industry hedged 0 to 25%. So it's killing them, and it's just uncomfortable for you. Maybe you're cheering for that because you're like, hey, this really hurts them a lot more than me. It puts them in a bad position. But generally, you don't want your hedges to do well. You want them just as a backstop, and it's only a portion. So that's another aspect, and that's the thing that most finance people don't get. It's not just most senior management. It's most finance people don't understand that. That's a risk management mentality that has to be understood by Treasury. That's not understood by every area of finance. And you can run into problems because they're like, oh, we lost money on the hedges. This was terrible. Your underlying exposure was fine. You were trying to protect it. And so that's the mentality where it's like, are you looking at things properly? What are we trying to do here? That correlates with, know your company and what their appetite is. And it's also, you have to make sure that you don't treat risk management and how you communicate what you're doing in the company as a single event. You teach them what it means. You have a session. You explain why are we hedging? Why are we putting these risk management techniques in place? Here's what it is. Great presentation. Nice PowerPoint. If you leave that alone, it won't even be a full year. It certainly won't be a couple of years before, if you have a problem, they're going to forget what you told them and they're going to be upset. And so you need to continue to share the risk management mentality and purpose in front of them. Here's what happened. Hey, our hedges made money. That's not great. It was nice because it protected us because we lost more money on our underlying exposures or underlying assets or whatever, or our liabilities, whatever those things happen to be, that it moved in the direction. Or we lost money on our hedge, but our underlying asset moved in the direction. We're in good shape. Those are a couple of those principles and concepts and maxims that I think help Treasury people and risk management people to understand that.
Yeah, and I know this is a whole environment you're looking at, but how do you prioritize where to spend your time?
Yeah, so if you've done your assessment, your scan, and you're continuing to scan to look for new areas, and you've calibrated those potential exposures, potential losses, and you said, these are all the ones that I have to mitigate. These are the ones that I'm watching because they might become big enough that I need to do something. If you've calibrated those and you figured out how you're going to handle those, the process is just to continue to do that and make sure it's working smoothly. So how do you prioritize what's the biggest issue, right? Is one of our Marines who worked here like to say was that, what's the alligator closest to the boat? You worry about that one. Well, especially if it's facing you and heading towards you, that's a bigger concern than a large one heading away or a small one heading away or a small one heading towards you. So it's a way of saying, what are the biggest risks? Which ones are a concern? So knowing what is something you have to be concerned about matters the most.
Do you have any other stories from experience, either good or bad, on risk management? Something that your team or someone that you've worked with avoided or fell into? Sure.
I'll give some examples. I won't do some of the famous ones, so I won't be giving some of the names, but I'll give this example. This has happened to multiple companies, and now people are doing a better job. But one was a company had hedged certain exposures. One example would be a company had an interest rate swap on their debt, and then when the company was sold to the other entity, they retired the debt, but they were supposed to retire the swap. And so now that piece of debt was gone, but the swap was out there meant to offset. If one moved in the wrong direction, if the debt moved in the wrong direction and went negative, there'd be a positive on the swap side, and vice versa. Well, those were meant to move in opposite directions. It was a nice risk management technique. Well, now the underlying asset was gone, so now you just had a swap, which becomes speculative, which means there's nothing that's moving in the opposite direction. And so, of course, what do you think happened? Well, there was now a mismatch. There's a swap that's just floating around. Of course, it moved in a negative direction, created all kinds of challenges.
This was an oversight when the company was bought?
Yeah. Yeah, it would be missing that. And so when you acquire things, it's like, oh, we're going to acquire the debt. I'm sure someone said, we'll retire the debt. We'll, end the swap. Well, the debt was retired, but the swap didn't. And of course, it moved in the wrong direction. I've seen that even on investment portfolios where there's an underlying asset and a swap or a hedge placed on the other side of it, and then someone sells the underlying asset, sells it as part of a portfolio swap, and the link wasn't, didn't give them an alert that says, now you got to get rid of this swap. And so they had some swaps that were sitting out there, and of course it moves in the wrong direction. I remember one very vividly where it was in the 6 digits, but because whenever you find these things, it's never, oh, we made a lot of money and we shouldn't have. Oh, that's terrible. It's always you find it when it's negative and you got to pay. So those are a couple of the examples of where risk management failed. And I'll just mention another category, not for today's discussion, but Excel, the use of Excel causing restatements on financial records, right? That's an operational risk. You can look and query and see how many people are like, oh, we had a problem because there was a problem with a spreadsheet that we used to feed into our financial statements. Successful, I think you asked about successful risk management stories.
Yeah.
In your notes, you said it could be from companies or personal situations. On the mortgage side, from my mindset, I know I can mentally show that it's better to buy to get your mortgage a variable rate mortgage. It's almost how long people hold homes, what the rates are, what those things do. It's almost always better. But I can't make myself do a variable rate mortgage, get a variable rate mortgage whenever I've financed or refinanced. I never felt comfortable doing it. And that was my emotions or feelings overruled my mind because I didn't want that overhead, that issue hanging over my head. So it was like, I went fixed. Those rates aren't going to change. The only thing I have to worry about is how taxes keep going up. That's part of the mindset of understanding your risk and your risk tolerance. My appetite was strong enough, but didn't like that. The other thing where successful risk management process worked. A client of ours was growing substantially, moving into more countries, needed to diversify. They had everything concentrated in a single bank, and we worked with them and helped add some additional banks. And they closed almost all their activity with their initial bank, and that initial bank ran into significant problems earlier in 2023. And it was nice because they diversified away. And so operationally, there was almost no exposure. And as we know, most of those banks, nobody suffered a loss at the time. But that was more than their primary bank. It was more than 90% of their activity and balances, well over 90% of their balances 18 months earlier. And as we helped them diversify, select banks that would meet their operational needs and also provide them growth for the future, it helped diversify and greatly reduce their exposure. And they breathed a pretty big sigh of relief when that had occurred. You can't move all that in a day. When there's bad news, it usually happens very quickly and things fall apart. And so this was part of that diversification principle that helped them certainly feel a lot more comfortable that during that weekend when everyone was trying to figure out how they're going to meet payroll, are they going to be able to get any funds out of the particular bank.
Well, thanks for sharing. Any final thoughts on risk management?
Yeah, I would emphasize one of the points that recognize that people don't understand risk management. They don't understand hedges. And you have to think about it as a process, not an event, a process to keep people informed about what you're doing and why. You have to do this continually. It doesn't matter that you told them, that you can refer to a memo, that you can even, have a picture of you shaking their hand, agreeing to it. But you have to keep reminding them, here's what we're doing. Here's why it's working. Even when, let's say your hedge moves in the wrong direction. Here's why it's working. This is what we're accomplishing. Here's how effective it was according to what we're trying to do. If you do that, you will have a much better career and much better feelings about other people in the organization.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.